The Great Hall of the Galactic Council was enormous. It was built from black stone and silver light floating somewhere between three stars that had no name in any human language. 7 platforms hung in the air, each one holding a representative from one of the 7 most powerful civilizations in the known galaxy. Their voices echoed there. Robes moved like water. They had been meeting in this hall for over 2,000 years, and in all that time, not one of them had ever truly been afraid. Today, they were not afraid either. Today they were simply annoyed. The council had called this session because of humans. It always seemed to be because of humans. Lately, in the last 40 years, humanity had pushed outward into space faster than any species the council had ever recorded. They built colonies on worlds that belonged to no one, or at least worlds that humans said belonged to no one. They built weapons that violated 7 separate agreements. They expanded like a flood, quietly and quickly, and every time the council sent a warning, the humans smiled, nodded, and kept building. The head of the council, a tall gray creature named Vorath, spoke. First, his voice was low and measured. Like a judge reading a sentence, he said that humanity had been warned enough times. He said that the colonies on the border worlds needed to be emptied. He said that Earth's new weapons needed to be destroyed. He said that humanity needed to accept a council overseer on their home planet, someone who would make sure the rules were followed from now on. Then he said the words that changed everything. He said that if Earth refused, the council would move to full military action within 30 days. Other 6 representatives voted. All 7 raised their hands. It was unanimous, clean, simple. The council's official emissary was sent to Earth that same hour, carrying a sealed message with all 7 signatures on it. The message was polite in its language, but clear in its meaning. It was in every real sense of the word a declaration of war with a deadline attached to it. The human government received the message. They read it in a cold, bright room with too many people in it and not enough answers between them. Ministers argued. Generals looked at each other. Someone said they needed to negotiate. Someone else said there was nothing left to negotiate. A third person said they needed to find her. Nobody in the room said her name out loud. They didn't need to. Everyone knew who they were talking about. The moon was called I-9 on official maps. It had no real weather, just a thick gray fog that rolled in from the frozen plains every morning and stayed until dark. There were maybe 200 people living there, mostly engineers and miners who kept to themselves. It was the kind of place you went when you wanted the rest of the galaxy to forget you existed. She had been here for 6 years. Her name was Inha. She was sitting at a wide metal table covered old star maps and printed battle reports. When Doan walked in, he was a tall man, lean and quiet, with short dark hair and eyes that always looked like they were doing math. He had served under Inha for 11 years before her exile, and when she was sent away, he had quietly followed. Nobody had ordered him to. He just went. He walked to the table, set a small data chip down next to her coffee, and stepped back. She didn't look up immediately. She finished reading the line she was on, then picked up the chip and held it under the small light above the table. She read slowly. Her face didn't change much. One eyebrow moved slightly and her jaw tightened for just a moment. Then she set the chip down and was quiet for A long time, outside the fog pressed against the small window above the table. The room was warm and dim. A old heater clicked somewhere in the corner. Doan stood with his hands behind his back and waited, because he had learned long ago that she always had something to say, and it was always worth waiting for. She picked up her coffee, took one slow sip, set it back down. At last she said quietly. Her voice was calm, not excited, not angry. It was the voice of someone who had been sitting by a door for a very long time, waiting for a knock, and had finally heard it. Doan said nothing. He just watched her. She stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the fog moved in slow gray waves. Across the flat ground, there was nothing beautiful about this moon. There never had been, but she had chosen it for a reason, and that reason had nothing to do with the view. How long have we got? She asked. The message gives Earth 30 days to respond, Doan said, but the government already knows. They can't fight this alone. They'll come to you within the week, 4 days. She said, what? They'll come in 4 days, not a week? They're already scared. She turned from the window. Who are they sending? Ryan in Ha almost smiled at that. Ryan was their best diplomat, sharp, fast, and clever enough to know when cleverness wasn't enough. Sending Ryan meant the government was serious. It meant they had already run out of other options. She want terms? And Ha said yes. She won't like mine. No, Doan agreed. She won't. And Ha looked down at the star maps on the table. Her eyes moved across them slowly, tracing lines between systems, between fleet positions, between the things she had been building quietly in her head for 6 long years. The council had made this decision in a clean, polished hall between 3 nameless stars. They had voted with calm hands and confident voices. They had spent maybe 2 hours deciding to go to war with humanity. She had spent 6 years deciding what to do. When they did, she reached down and moved one of the old maps aside. Under it was a thick document, handwritten on real paper, with a title at the top that the government had once called dangerous, irresponsible, and deeply alarming. She put her hand on it gently, like it was something she had missed. Wake the others, she said. Tell them it's time. Doan turned and walked to the door. Before he reached it, she spoke one more time, still looking down at the document. And Doan, he stopped. Tell them I'm not angry. A quiet pause. Tell them I'm ready. He nodded once and left. She stood alone in the warm, dim room with the fog outside and the star maps under her hands, and for the first time in 6 years, the long waiting finally felt like it was over. Ryan arrived on the 3rd day, not the 4th. In Ha had been wrong by 1 day, which almost never happened, and she noted it without expression and said nothing about it. The shuttle landed on the flat, frozen ground outside the small cluster of buildings that made up in Ha's base. Ryan stepped out wearing a dark coat and no expression on her face, which was the look she always wore when she was trying to hide the fact that she was nervous. She was a lean woman with sharp eyes and short black hair that she kept tucked behind one ear. She had once talked 3 different alien governments out of a shooting war using nothing but a dinner table and 4 hours of conversation. She was one of the best in the business. She had still asked twice on the shuttle ride whether this was really necessary. Doan met her outside and walked her in. He offered nothing, said little, and brought her to a small side room with 2 chairs and a table between them. He told her and Ha would come when she was ready. Then he left Ryan alone in the room with a cup of tea that was already going cold. Ryan waited. An hour passed. She drank the cold tea anyway. She looked at her notes on her small device and rehearsed what she was going to say. She had prepared 3 different approaches. The respectful one, the urgent one, and the one where she appealed to Inha's old sense of duty to Earth. She had ranked them in order of what she thought would work best. She had a feeling none of them would work at all. Inha came in quietly. She didn't knock. She just appeared in the doorway and then sat down across from Ryan without ceremony or greeting. She was wearing plain gray clothes, her dark hair pulled back, her face clean and rested. She looked in every outward way like a woman who had been living a calm and simple life. Nothing about her looked dangerous. But Ryan had read her file. Ryan had read her file 3 times on the shuttle ride here. You look well, Ryan said, because she needed to start somewhere. You look tired, Inha replied. How bad is it? Ryan set down her device. There was no point in the slow approach. Inha would see through it in about 30 seconds, and it would only waste time. The Council is moving 7 combined fleets into position along our outer boundary. Snorts, we've confirmed at least 400 warships. Our own fleet is strong, but we've never fought all 7 at once. The simulation teams say we lose within 5 months. The optimistic one say 8. She paused. We need you. I know, Inha. The government is prepared to offer you full reinstatement, your rank, your clearances, your command. I don't want reinstatement, Inha. I want the war unstopped. What does that mean? It means no committee reviews my decisions. No minister gets to pause an operation because it makes them uncomfortable. No one pulls me back when I'm in the middle of something, because the Council sent another polite message asking us to talk. Inha leaned forward slightly. I make the calls, all of them, from the first move to the last. You give me the war and I give you the win. Those are my terms. The room was quiet. For a moment, Ryan had expected demands. She had not expected them to be this clean and this total. The government won't like that, Ryan said carefully. I know. That's why I'm telling you and not them. Inha sat back. You understand what I'm asking, and you understand why. The government exiled me because my method scared them, and now the Council has done exactly what I told everyone they would eventually do. I need you to walk back in there and tell them the price of their own fear is that they don't get a vote this time. Ryan looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, if I take this back and they agree, and that is not certain, you will be responsible for everything that happens. Yes, Inha said simply. People will die. People will die either way. The difference is whether we win or lose. While they're dying, another silence. Outside the building, the wind moved across the frozen ground in a low, steady sound. Ryan looked down at the table, then back up. I need to know something first, she said, before I take this back. I need to understand why the Council is actually afraid of you, not the official reason, not the treaty violations, the real reason. She hesitated. What did you do 6 years ago that scared everyone so badly they'd rather exile you than keep you? Inha was quiet for a moment, then she told her, 6 years ago, a minor border conflict had broken out near a small colony called Perrin 5. 3 Council warships had moved in to pressure the colony into surrendering its mineral rights. Earth sent 2 frigates to respond, small ships lightly armed meant to show presence rather than fight. The Council ships opened fire without warning. One of the frigates was destroyed in the first 30 seconds. Inha had been a senior fleet commander at the time, stationed 2 systems away. She redirected her ship without orders, arrived at Perrin 5, and in 11 minutes had reverse-engineered the Council ship's own weapons grid. Using the destroyed frigate's final transmission data, she turned their targeting system against them. All 3 Council warships were disabled. No Council crew members were killed, but every ship was crippled beyond repair. After the battle, she did not file a standard incident report. She filed the Horizon Doctrine. It was a full war plan, not a defensive strategy, not a response protocol, a complete detailed plan for how humanity could end any future conflict with the Council permanently, not by destroying them but by making humanity so structurally, technologically, and strategically powerful that attacking humans would be recognized by every civilization in the galaxy as an act of suicide. The plan called for things the government found deeply uncomfortable: embedded intelligence operatives inside every Council civilization, weapons development that went far beyond any existing treaty, preemptive disruption of enemy supply networks before any war was even declared, and a final clause that said in plain language that the goal was not peace through goodwill, but peace through the complete certainty of devastating consequence. The government had read it, gone pale, called it dangerous and irresponsible, and exiled her within the week. Rian listened to all of this without interrupting. When Inha finished, the room was very still. And in 6 years, Ryan said slowly, have you been sitting here doing nothing? No, Inha said. Have you been building it? The doctrine. Inha looked at her steadily. Go back and tell them yes or no. I don't need anything else from you. Ryan stood up. She picked up her device, tucked it under her arm, and looked at Inha one more time. She thought about the 400 warships on the outer boundary. She thought about the simulation that said 5 months. She thought about the government sitting in that cold, bright room with no answers. I'll be back in 2 days, she said. I'll be here, Inha replied. Ryan walked out. The door closed behind her. Inha sat alone in the small room. For a while, her hands flat on the table, looking at nothing in particular. She was not nervous. She was not excited. She was the same steady, waiting thing she had been for 6 years. But the door had been knocked on, and she had finally answered. Rian came back. In 2 days, as she said she would. She walked in without the nervous look this time. She sat down, put both hands on the table, and said 4 words. They agreed all terms. Inhan nodded once, stood up, and walked out of the room. That was the end of the conversation. Within 6 hours, the small base on AI-9 changed completely. Ships that had been sitting dark and cold in the covered hangars were powered up one by one. Doan moved through the base, giving quiet instructions to people who had been waiting for this moment for a long time. The engineers who had been living here for years, working in silence, building things that had no official name and no official approval, started moving their equipment out of storage and into active status. Inha stood in the largest room of the base, which had been set up as a full command space, and looked at the people around her. They were not many, maybe 30 in total, but they were exactly who she had chosen, and she had chosen each of them for a very specific reason. Junho was there. He was younger than most in the room, with a thin face and quick eyes behind plain glasses. He was the one who got nervous around in Ha the most, which was strange because he was also the one who had built the most terrifying thing she had ever asked for. He stood near his workstation, holding a tablet and trying to look calm. Sarah was there too. She was a small woman who moved like she weighed nothing and spoke in a voice so quiet you had to lean in to hear her. She commanded Earth's Black Ops Division, though that division officially did not exist. She had short hair, a plain face, and the kind of eyes that made you feel like she had already read everything you were about to say. She had been running silent operations inside 3 of the 7 council civilizations for the last 4 years. Nobody in any of those civilizations knew her name. Inhai looked around the room at all of them and spoke plainly. She said the council had made a decision. In a polished hall between 3 stars, they had voted to go to war with humanity. They had done it calmly and confidently because they believed, after years of watching humans, that they understood what humans were. They had seen the ships, they had counted the weapons, they had run their own numbers. She said the council had made the mistake of calculating what humanity could do. They had not calculated what she had already done. She turned to Janho first. He had been with her since the 3rd year of her exile. She had found him through a mutual contact, a young engineer who had been quietly let go from Earth's official weapons program after he kept pushing for developments that the program director called unnecessarily aggressive. Inha had read his proposals. They were not unnecessarily aggressive. They were simply 10 years ahead of what anyone else was willing to build. She had brought him to AI-9 and told him to build everything he had ever wanted to build, with no restrictions and no review board looking over his shoulder. He had spent 3 years doing exactly that. The most important thing he had built was what he called very simply a jump disruptor. It was a device able to be mounted on any mid-sized ship that could send a targeted pulse through the fold space that faster than light travel depended on if a fleet was mid-jump, and a jump disruptor fired at the right frequency and angle, every ship in that fleet would drop out of jump simultaneously in random locations, with their systems temporarily scrambled in open space far from any fuel source. A fleet dropped this way was not destroyed, it was simply stranded. Stranded fleets did not fight wars. They called for rescue ships and burned through their power trying to figure out where they were. Junho had tested the disruptor twice on unmanned ships in deep empty space where no one would notice. Both tests worked perfectly. He had told Inha the results in a flat, quiet voice, and then immediately asked if he could sit down because his legs felt strange. She had told him to sit down and then told him he had done very well. Now she stood in front of him in the command room and asked him if the production units were ready. He nodded. 20 disruptors had been built and were already loaded on ships in the hangar. She told him to prep 10 more just in case, and he went immediately back to his station. Then she turned to Sara. Sara had been working in the dark for 4 years. Her people were embedded inside 3 council civilizations, the VTH, The growl and the sonori under false identities in positions close enough to power to hear things that were never meant to leave those rooms. They sent reports back through a communication chain so layered and encoded that even Ryan's intelligence division had never detected it. The information Sarah had gathered over 4 years was in simple terms extraordinary. She knew the Council's largest fleet formation, their most powerful combined force, was scheduled to make a jump through a specific corridor in neutral space within the first 2 weeks of the war. This was their plan: to arrive quickly at Earth's outer boundary from an unexpected direction. The jump would take approximately 9 hours. In the middle of that jump, in the darkest and most isolated part of the route, they would be completely unreachable by anyone. That was exactly where Inha planned to strand them. Sarah also knew something else, something quieter and more useful. 3 of the 7 council civilizations had been arguing with each other behind closed doors for years over territory that had nothing to do with humans. The VTH and the Growl had a border disagreement that was old and deep and bitter. The Sonori believed that Growl had cheated them in a trade deal 14 years ago. These things had been politely set aside when the council voted to move against humanity. Sora had been nudging them very carefully, very slowly, feeding each one information, true information, slightly shaped, that kept the old bitterness warm. One well-timed revelation at the right moment could crack the council's alliance from within. Inha looked at Sora and said, "When?" Sora said, "Week 2. Inha said, "Make it week 1. Sora nodded without any visible reaction and went back to her station. Dawn stood at Inha's side through all of this, watching the room organize itself with the efficiency of something that had been rehearsed many times. He had watched her build this for 6 years. He had seen the early plans on paper, then the first test results, then the slow, careful placement of people and tools in exactly the right positions. He had watched it all come together the way very long and patient construction project finally shows you the building. It was always going to be. They think they've started something," he said, quietly, standing next to her as the room worked around them. "They think, lot of things," Inha said. She was looking at the star map on the main screen, her eyes moving across the Council's fleet positions, the jump corridors, the political fracture lines between civilizations. That's been their problem from the beginning. She reached forward and touched the screen, drawing a slow line between 2 points, the corridor where the Council's largest fleet would jump, and the position where 3 of Junho's disruptor ships would be waiting. They declared war, she said, more to herself than to him. They spent 2 hours deciding it. They signed their names and felt certain. She looked at the map. "I've been deciding this for 6 years." She stepped back from the screen. "Begin," she said. The room moved. The Council expected a slow war. That was the honest truth of it. They had studied humanity for years. They had watched how humans organized, how their military responded to pressure, how long it took their government to make decisions. They had looked at every conflict Earth had been part of and built a model that said the same thing every time. Humans were capable, humans were clever, but humans needed time. Time to mobilize, time to agree, time to stop arguing with each other long enough to actually move. The Council had 400 warships on the boundary. They had supply lines Stretched across 6 systems, they had a plan that was solid and reasonable and had worked against 4 other civilizations in the past 200 years. They had given Earth 30 days to respond before the first shot was fired. They did not expect anything to happen on day 4, on the 4th day of the deadline period before Earth had officially given any response at all. The Council's largest combined fleet, 260 warships from 4 different civilizations, began their long jump through the neutral corridor. The jump was 9 hours. It was the most ambitious single movement of the Council's military in decades. When it completed, the fleet would arrive at Earth's outer boundary from a direction that human sensors would not expect, cutting off 2 of Earth's main supply routes in a single stroke. On hour 5 of that 9-hour jump, every single ship in the fleet dropped out of faster than light travel at the same moment. Not one ship, not a section of the fleet, all of them. 260 warships scattered across 300,000 km of empty, unnamed space. Systems scrambled, engines cycling down, communication arrays confused and searching for signals that weren't there. 3 small ships that no one had seen, running without transponders, had already come and gone. The fleet spent the next 18 hours trying to figure out where they were. Then they spent another 12 hours trying to reach the Council for rescue coordination. By the time the Council understood what had happened, the fleet was 31 hours behind schedule and had used 40% of its fuel reserve, just keeping its systems running in deep, empty space. They did not make it to Earth's outer boundary. The Council called it a technical failure at first, because the idea that humans had developed something capable of doing that quietly ahead of any declaration of war without any warning was not something their analysts were prepared to accept. It took them another day to accept it. By the time they did, and Ha had already moved on to the second operation. In the 3rd week, Ryan stood in a glass-walled room on Earth and watched 2 Council diplomatic channels collapse within 6 hours of each other. The first was between the VATH and the Growl. Recording appeared, origin unclear, officially untraceable, of a high-ranking GRO commander making comments about VTH territorial rights that were deeply offensive by any standard of vet culture. The recording was authentic. It had been made 14 months ago in a private meeting, and the Growl commander had said those things because he genuinely believed them. He had just never expected anyone outside the room to hear it. SARS people had been in that room. Within 4 hours, the VTH had recalled their ambassador from the Growl home world. Within 6 hours, the vet's military ate to the Council. Joint Command had quietly stopped attending coordination meetings. The second collapse was subtler. A series of financial documents appeared in the Sonori public record, documents showing exactly how the Growl had structured the trade deal from 14 years ago, including internal notes showing that the Growl negotiators had known the deal favored them significantly and had deliberately steered the Sonori representatives away from noticing the documents were real. They had been buried in the Growl's own archive system for over a decade. SARS people had been in that archive too. The Sonori did not recall their ambassador. What they did instead was quietly stop sharing intelligence with the Council Joint Command. They stopped contributing to the fuel redistribution that was supposed to support the stranded fleet rescue operation, they began having long private conversations with their own military that they were not reporting upward. The Council's alliance had 7 members. Within 3 weeks of the war's beginning, 3 of those members were focused less on fighting humanity and more on watching each other on the ground, or rather, space, in moved her actual military forces in a way that the Council's remaining fleet commanders found deeply disorienting. She did not mass her ships, she did not hold a line, she moved in small, fast groups, never staying anywhere long enough to be targeted, hitting supply points and communication relays rather than warships. Every time a council commander positioned their forces to respond to one threat, the threat was already gone, and 2 smaller problems had appeared somewhere else. One council commander, a decorated veteran named Ashen, sent a private message to the council leadership on day 18 of the war. It was later recovered and read by Inha's intelligence team. In it, Ashen said that he had fought 6 wars in his career and had never encountered an opponent that seemed to have already read every response he made. Before he made it, he was not far wrong. Doan managed the tactical map from the command center, and every move the council made had already been anticipated in some version of Inha's 6 years of preparation, not because she could see the future, but because she had spent 6 years studying these specific civilizations, their specific commanders, their specific tendencies. Under pressure, she had read every recorded conflict they had been part of. She had built a picture of how each of them thought she knew that Veth commanders became aggressive when confused. She knew that Growl commanders pulled back to defensive positions when their supply lines were threatened. She knew that the Sonori prioritized protecting their own ships above all other tactical considerations. She used all of it. On day 22, the Council issued its first ceasefire request. The message was formal and calm, and worded as if it were an equal negotiation between 2 parties. It said the Council was willing to discuss terms. It said there was no need for further escalation. Inha read the message and set it aside. The next morning, she hit 3 more relay stations along the Council's main communication corridor, cutting their Joint Command's real-time contact with the stranded fleet, which had finally been partly recovered but was now running on emergency power by 60%. The Council sent another ceasefire request the following day. This one was less calm. Doan brought it to her personally. She read it, put it face down on the table, and looked at the map. They're scared, he said. There was no satisfaction in her voice when she answered. There was nothing warm or triumphant. She simply said good, and circled the next target on the screen with one finger. Then she looked at him with steady eyes. They should have been scared 6 years ago, she said. They should have been scared when they exiled me instead of listening to me. They should have been scared when they voted with their clean hands in that clean hall. She looked back at the map. Fear now is the only thing they have left that's useful. She picked up her pen. Get Sarah, we're moving on the Sonori separation tonight. If they're going to fracture the alliance, I want it done publicly and loud enough that the other 4 can't pretend they don't see it. Doan went to find Sora. Inha stayed at the table alone with the map in the night, the way she had been alone with her plans for 6 quiet years on a cold and foggy moon, except now the plans were not on paper anymore. Now they were burning across the galaxy, in real time, and every star on the map was a problem she had already solved. The war ended on day 41. Not with a great final battle, not with a last desperate push from either side. It ended the way a structure ends when you have removed enough of the supports underneath it, not with a dramatic crash but with a slow and certain collapse that everyone could see coming. And nobody could stop. By day 30, the Sonari had formally suspended their participation in the Council's joint military command. They issued a public statement that was careful in its language but clear in its meaning. They said they were reviewing their alliance commitments in light of recent information. They said they were not enemies of humanity. They said nothing about the growl, but everyone in the galaxy who could read between lines understood exactly what they meant. By day 35, the VTH had done the same. Their statement was shorter and angrier in tone. They mentioned without specifics that the terms of the original war vote had not been fully honored by all parties. Their ambassador to the Council joint session had left the building and had not returned. With the Sonori and the Vet effectively gone, the Council's military structure became something very different. What had been 7 civilizations acting in a coordinated way was now 5, and 2 of those 5 were watching the other 3 with increasing nervousness, wondering what information might surface about them next. In hand did not hit them harder. In those final days, she did not need to. She simply kept moving, kept pressing, kept being present everywhere, and settled nowhere, and let the fear and the fractures do the rest of the work. On day 40, the Council's head, Voreth, sent a message directly to Earth's government. It was not a ceasefire request this time. It did not use polite treaty language. It was short, and it simply asked what humanity's terms were for ending the conflict. Ryan brought the message to Inha. Personally, she set it on the table and watched Inha read it. They want terms. Ryan said, I know what they want. Inha said. She folded the message and set it down. Tell them to come here. Ryan blinked. Here to Ori 9, no to the ship. Inha stood and picked up the document that had been sitting on her table for 6 years. The thick handwritten pages of the Horizon Doctrine, worn at the edges now from being read, and sat down and read again. Tell all 7 representatives to come in person, not delegates, not junior staff. Them. Ryan stared at her for a moment. Vor will object to that. Let him. Inha tucked the document under her arm and tell him that if even one representative refuses to come, I will take that as a refusal of terms and continue operations. She walked toward the door. They called a vote in that hall of theirs. I'm calling one on mine. The meeting was held on Inha's flagship, a long gray vessel called the Hayo, which had no decoration on its hull and no ceremony in its corridors. The 7 council representatives arrived by individual shuttles and were escorted by SARS people to a plain meeting room near the center of the ship. There were no ornate chairs. There were no refreshments. There was a long metal table, seats on both sides, and lighting that was functional but nothing more. Voreth arrived last. He was tall and gray and still managed to carry himself with the posture of someone who was accustomed to being the most powerful being in any room. He looked at the plain walls and the metal table, and his expression shifted just slightly. The first small crack in the composure he had maintained for 41 days of losing. Inha walked in from the opposite side of the room and sat down across from him without speaking. For a moment no one said anything. The 7 representatives sat on one side, Inhas sat on the other with Doan to her left and Ryan to her right. The document sat on the table in front of her. Voreth spoke first. He said, "The council was prepared to discuss return to the original terms humanity, withdrawing from border worlds, submitting to some level of oversight, with guarantees of safety for all human colonies in council-adjacent space." He spoke for 4 minutes. He was composed and reasonable. He used the word mutual several times. When he finished, Inha looked at him for a moment without expression. Then she opened the document on the table and slid it across to him. "These are the terms," she said. He looked down at it. He read the first page slowly, then the second. His posture changed as he read, not dramatically, but the room felt it. One of the other representatives leaned over to read alongside him, then another. The silence in the room became a different kind of silence. Var looked up. His voice was controlled, but the control was working harder than before. He said the document was not a peace agreement. He said it read more like a takeover. He said the clause requiring all 7 council civilizations to permanently share military and technological intelligence with Earth was unprecedented. He said the clause giving humanity full power on the council was not something any species had ever been given. He said the clause declaring any act of aggression toward any human target to be an act against every species under council protection was an extraordinary overreach. He said with great care that these terms were an act of domination. Inha listened to all of it. She let him finish completely, then she folded her hands on the table. 6 years ago, she said, your council called my plans dangerous. You said my methods were irresponsible. The government I served was so afraid of what I was proposing that they exiled me to a moon in the middle of nowhere, rather than keep me around and have to think about the questions I was raising. The room was very still, and then she said, after 6 years, you declared war on us anyway. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. You spent 2 hours voting. You signed your names and felt certain. You pointed 400 warships at our boundary because you had calculated what we were capable of and decided the calculation was in your favor. She looked at Voreth steadily. What you did not calculate, what none of you accounted for in all your years of watching us, was what I had already done. She let that sit for a moment. You called my doctrine an act of domination 6 years ago. You call it an act of domination today, but I want you to think carefully about what you are actually sitting across from right now. I'm not the most powerful person in humanity. I'm not the best of us or the most loved or the most representative of what humans want to be. She paused. I am what humans become when you make us wait long enough and afraid enough and angry enough. I am not humanity at its best. Her voice was quiet and even, and I am sitting across from 7 civilizations. That could not defeat me, Voreth said. Nothing. No one in the room said anything. These terms are not a punishment. Inha said they are a structure. They are the architecture of a situation where no one in this galaxy ever again believes that going to war with humans is a reasonable calculation. She looked down the row of representatives, one face at a time. Sign them and this ends today. Every ship goes home. Every stranded fleet gets rescue support from us. Every border colony stays where it is with full legal protection. She looked back at Voreth. Refuse them and I continue. And the thing you need to understand about me, the one thing that is absolutely true is that I have more patience than you do. I have had 6 years of practice. The room was quiet for a long time. Then one by one the representatives looked at the document. One of them picked up a pen, then another. Voreth sat still the longest. He looked at the table. He looked at the document. He looked at it. He picked up the pen. Ryan watched it happen from her seat at the table and felt something she could not quite name. It was not exactly pride and not exactly relief. It was something older and quieter, the feeling of watching something inevitable finally arrive. Later, standing in the corridor outside, while the representatives were escorted back to their shuttles, she stood next to Doan and said nothing for a while. She's frightening, Ryan said eventually. Not as a criticism, just as a fact. Yes. Doan agreed. He said nothing else. Inside the meeting room, Inhai sat alone. For a moment after everyone else had gone, the document was gone. It would be filed, recorded, sent out across every channel, made official in every language that existed in the known galaxy. What had been handwritten on paper in an exile 6 years ago was now the law that governed the most powerful governing body in the galaxy. She looked at the empty table. She thought about the fog on Ari 9. She thought about the long, quiet years, the maps, the dark hangars, Junho's nervous face, Sora's quiet eyes, Doan standing in every doorway she had ever walked through. She thought about the knock she had been waiting for. Doan appeared in the doorway. He was holding 2 small glasses. She looked at him. He walked in and set one down in front of her, then stood across the table. She picked it up. Now, she said softly, looking out at nothing, they'll never forget what humans are capable of. She took a sip. The galaxy, for the first time in 2,000 years, was afraid of exactly the right thing. And somewhere, far away, in the polished hall between 3 nameless stars, the seats of the Galactic Council sat in silence, and one of them, for the first time, belonged to Earth. The chamber was quiet the way graveyard is quiet, not peaceful, just empty of anything alive enough to make noise. 7 thrones sat in a wide circle above the clouds of Zenith Prime, held up by a station so old that 3 different species claimed they built it. The lights inside were soft gold, the kind that made everyone look important and wise, even when they were neither. The Galactic Accord Council had been meeting in this chamber for over 400 years. They had ended wars here, started a few too, though they never called it that. They called it correction. They called it necessary action. They called it restoring order to the stars. Today, they called it justice. Ambassador Drain of the Sulcan spoke first, as he always did. He was tall, pale blue, with 6 fingers on each hand and a voice that sounded like 2 people talking at the same time. He stood at the center of the circle and read from a long list, each item spoken clearly, each one meant to sound like proof. Humanity, he said, had violated 11 interstellar trade agreements. Humanity had refused 3 separate requests to submit to the Council's bioscan program, which tracked population data across the galaxy. Humanity had established colonies on 4 worlds that sat inside protected Space systems, the Council had marked. Off-limits dead worlds with no life. But still the rule was the rule, and humanity had on no fewer than 6 recorded occasions told Council representatives to leave their space and not come back. And they had never apologized, not once. The other ambassadors listened, some nodded. The Dravathi ambassador clicked his hard outer shell in a way that meant agreement. The Fenori pair, 2 small creatures who shared a single vote and always sat so close they looked like one, bobbed their heads together. Thick representative, huge and gray and old as stone, simply stared forward with the expression of someone who had already made up their mind before walking through the door. Only Admiral Ketra of the Voreth was still. He sat with his 4 arms folded, his 4 eyes moving slowly around the room. He was the only military mind on the Council. Everyone else was a diplomat or a politician. He was neither. He was a person who had spent 60 years studying how wars were won and lost, and right now watching his colleagues nod and click and agree. He felt something cold moving through his chest. The vote was fast, 6 in favor, 1 against. Ketra's hand stayed down. Dra looked at him with something between pity and annoyance. Your objection, Admiral. Ketra was quiet for a moment, then he said slowly and clearly, you have never seen them truly angry. Nobody answered that. Nobody thought it needed an answer. The declaration was written, sealed, and sent. It went out on every frequency, in every language used across the known galaxy, including all 7 of humanity's main dialects. It reached every human ship, every colony, every deep space station, every lonely little outpost sitting at the edge of explored space. The message was simple, though the wording was long. It said that humanity was in violation of Council law. It said that humanity had been given chances to correct this and had refused. It said that as of the moment of transmission, the Galactic Accord Council had formally declared state of war between the Council and the human species. It gave humanity 72 hours to lay down its weapons, recall its military vessels, and submit to Council authority. It also said near the end in smaller text that was still clearly meant to be read that humanity's continued refusal to cooperate had been noted as a sign of primitive political development, and that the Council hoped this action would help human civilization mature into a responsible member of galactic society. That last part was not necessary. Someone had added it anyway. The Council adjourned. There was no celebration, but there was satisfaction, the kind that comes from finally doing something you had been putting off for too long. Drain spoke briefly to the Dravathi ambassador as they walked toward the exit, and the words swift resolution and minimal resistance passed between them like a done deal. Ketra did not walk with them. He stood at the great window and looked out at the stars for a long time. The ISV Relentless was not a pretty ship. It had been built for work, not show long, and dark, with a hole that had been patched so many times in different metals that it looked like a quilt someone had made during a power outage. It was a deep reconnaissance vessel, which meant its job was to go far out into the dark, find things, and come back with information. It was fast, quiet, and crewed by people who did not mind being far from home for long stretches of time. Commander Lyra Voss had captained it for 9 years. She was not tall, not impressive to look at, not the kind of person a stranger would notice walking through a crowd. Medium. Height, dark hair cut short, and practical, a face that had spent too many years under recycled ship air and artificial light. She had a small scar along her left jaw from a mission she never talked about, and she had the habit of going very, very still when she was thinking hard about something. She was very still now. The transmission had come in 40 minutes ago. She had read it once fast, then twice slowly, then a third time even slower. The data pad sat on the console in front of her. Her coffee was beside it, going cold. The bridge was empty except for her and the soft hum of the ship systems and the quiet voice of Myra, the ship's AI, who had been waiting patiently without saying a word. The stars outside the viewport moved slowly as the Relentless drifted on its patrol route. A long, quiet stretch of nothing in every direction, just the dark and the light of distant suns. Lyra read the last line of the transmission one more time, the one about primitive political development, the one about helping humanity mature. She set the data pad down. She thought about the 6 wars she had served in. Before this one, 3 of them were wars. The history books remembered 3 of them were the kind that never got official names because the people who authorized them didn't want the paperwork. She thought about the people she had served with, most of them still alive, some of them not. She thought about the colonies, the real ones, the ones she had been to, small and hard and full of people who had gone out to the edge of explored space with nothing but tools and hope and the stubborn human belief that it was worth trying. She thought about what it meant for someone to look at all of that and call it primitive. She was quiet for a long time. Myra's voice came gently through the bridge speakers, calm, patient, a voice designed to be easy to hear without being startling. Your orders, Commander. The ship drifted. The stars moved slowly past the viewport. Somewhere, 6 ambassadors were already planning what to do with a humanity that rolled over and gave up. Lyra reached out and picked up her coffee. She took one sip, even though it was cold, because she had learned a long time ago not to waste things. Then she set it back down, and the corner of her mouth moved just a small thing, just barely, the kind of expression that someone else might miss if they were not paying close attention, but Myra was always paying attention. Finally, Lyra said the word came out quietly, no anger in it, no fear, no excitement even, just a kind of deep, settled calm, the calm of someone who had been waiting a long time for something to become simple, and it had finally become simple. She reached forward and opened a channel to the crew. All hands, she said. This is the Commander. We have received a transmission from the Galactic Accord Council. I am sending it to your personal terminals now. Read it, then get some sleep. We have a long road ahead, and I want everyone sharp. She paused just for a second. We're going to be fine, she added. Trust me. She closed the channel and started working. The Relentless moved quietly through the dark, and the 72-hour clock began. The Council expected noise. That was the honest truth of it, though none of them would have said it out loud in those words. They expected transmissions, panic calls from human colony governors, emergency broadcasts from their military command, angry speeches, maybe, or desperate ones, some kind of signal that the declaration had landed and that humanity was scrambling to respond, arguing, dividing the way they always seemed to do when something went wrong. What they got was silence. Not the silence of an empty channel, not static, not a technical problem, just nothing. Humanity received the declaration, and then humanity went quiet, and the quiet stretched out across the 72 hours like a held breath. And not a single human representative contacted the council to negotiate, surrender object, or even ask a question. By hour 40, some of the ambassadors were beginning to feel uneasy, though they told themselves and each other that this was simply the silence of a species that knew it was beaten and had not yet found the words to admit it. Ketra did not say anything. He spent those 40 hours in his private office reading files he had pulled from the council's own historical archives. Old records, some of them dusty with disuse from the early days of first contact with humanity. He read them slowly and carefully, and the cold thing in his chest got colder. The other species of the Galactic Accord had stories about how they reached the stars. The sulking told theirs often because it was beautiful, a long age of peace and philosophy, centuries of slow and steady scientific progress, a species that looked up at the sky and thought we should go there, and then went gently and with care. Their first contact with another species had been warm. They had exchanged art, they had exchanged music. They had built a friendship that lasted to this day. The Voreth story was harder. There had been a long war on their home world, a bad one, and when it ended, the surviving nations had agreed that going to space together was better than dying apart. It was a story about choosing peace after pain. Ketra had grown up proud of that story. The Dravathi had been guided. An older species, now gone, had found them early and helped them reach the stars with a gentle hand, leaving behind technology and maps and knowledge. It was, by all accounts, a gift. Every species in the Accord had something like this: a hand extended, a door opened, a moment where the galaxy said, "You are not alone." And the species in question stepped through into something larger. Humanity had none of that. Humanity climbed out of its cradle world alone, with nobody watching and nobody helping, on a planet that had been actively trying to kill them for the entirety of their existence. Their world had predators larger and stronger than they were. It had diseases that changed faster than medicine could catch them. It had ice ages, droughts, floods, and geological events that wiped out whole populations and left the survivors to start over. And layered on top of all of that, humanity fought itself long, terrible wars over land and resources and beliefs, and sometimes just because the group on the other side of the river was different, and that felt like a reason. They nearly went extinct 6 times before they built their first spaceship. 6 times. Ketra had checked the number twice because he hadn't believed it, and somehow every time they came back, they did not come back because something saved them. They came back because enough of them refused to stop, refused to lie down, refused to accept that this was the end. They were by any scientific measure not the strongest creatures on their world, not the fastest, not the most physically powerful. What they had was the ability to think their way through problems, to work together in groups, to pass knowledge down through generations, and to hold onto the will to survive long after it would have made logical sense to let go. They reached space carrying all of that with them, all of it. The wars and the plagues and the near extinctions and the memories of what it cost to still be standing. They brought it into the stars. the same way a person who survived a very bad winter brings their coat even when the weather seems warm. They never stop being the species that survived. 6. Extinctions. The Council had looked at humanity and seen a young, aggressive, rule-breaking civilization that needed to be managed. Ketra looked at the same history and saw something that made him want to go back into that chamber and overturn every throne in it. By the time the 72 hours ended with no response, the Council voted quickly and with slightly less certainty than before, though nobody admitted that to move forward with the first military action. The Voreth Vanguard Fleet was chosen. 300 ships, the most decorated armada in the Accord. Their commander, Fleet Master Joreth, was experienced and capable, and he accepted the assignment with the calm confidence of someone who had won every battle he had ever fought. His target was Harrow's Edge, a human colony on the outer frontier, medium-sized, lightly defended by last intelligence report, situated in a system with no strategic backup. The plan was simple: arrive, demonstrate force, demand the colonies surrender, and establish it as a sign to the rest of human space that the Council's declaration was not empty words. Joreth was not worried. He had fought harder opponents for lesser reasons. What nobody on the Council had noticed, because they were not looking, and because they did not think it mattered, was what humanity had been doing during those 72 hours of silence. They had not been panicking. They had not been arguing. They had not been calling emergency meetings or trying to find diplomatic back channels or drafting apology letters. They had been working on the ISV, relentless. Lyra had spent the entire 72 hours on very little sleep and a great deal of coffee, sending and receiving short encrypted messages that went out to destinations across human space. She did not send orders. She sent a request, one clear, simple request, and she signed it with her name and her rank and nothing else. The response came back within hours from old veterans who had been sitting in retirement on colony worlds, from young pilots fresh out of training who had heard the transmission and were already walking toward their ships, from engineers and doctors and scientists who also happened to know how to fight, from merchant captains who redirected their routes without being asked, from small frontier stations that pulled their single patrol ships and asked where they were needed. Humanity did not have a single massive military command that gave orders and expected obedience. It had never worked that way and probably never would. What it had instead was a shared understanding, old as the species, worn into the bone, of what it meant when something came at the people you loved, and what was expected of you when it did. You showed up, you brought what you had, and you did not stop. The Council's tactical systems, watching human space for signs of military buildup, saw something confusing. Human ships were moving, yes, but not massing. They were spreading out, going in different directions, dispersing across a wide arc of space in what looked to every model. The Council ran like a disorganized retreat, like a population scattering fear in the Voreth Tactical Center. The analysts labeled it uncoordinated withdrawal under pressure of declaration, and logged it as a sign of low morale. Ketra saw the same data and did not log it as anything. He stared at the screen for a long time, watching the scattered pattern of moving ships, and thought about an old word he had read in a human file during those 40 hours of research. The word was hunting, when the Voreth Vanguard fleet prepared to jump to Harrow's Edge, Ketra quietly filed a request to be informed of the result. The moment contact was made, he did not file it with confidence. He filed it the way you check a lock you are almost sure you remembered to close, because the cost of being wrong is too high not to check. The jump was made. 300 ships crossed the dark between stars. Ketra waited. Stars outside his window looked the same. As always, cold and far away, and completely indifferent to what was about to happen. He pressed 4 hands together, a Voreth habit done when one was trying to be patient, and he waited. The silence from Harrow's Edge was different from the silence of the last 72 hours. This silence had weight. Voreth Vanguard fleet dropped out of faster than light travel in perfect formation. 300 ships arranged the way Fleet Master Jorah always arranged them, a wide forward wedge, support vessels in the middle, heavy guns along the outer edges, clean, professional, the kind of formation that had won battles across 6 different systems and 2 different wars. Jorah stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Voreth Eternal, and looked at the viewscreen as the star system of Harrow's Edge resolved into focus. He had expected a colony, domes, maybe power signatures, defense platforms of some kind, old ones, probably, given the last intelligence report. Some panicked hails asking for terms. The system was quiet. He leaned forward in his command chair. Scan the 3rd planet, he said. His scan officer was already working. The silence that followed lasted about 15 seconds, which was long enough for Jorah to feel the first small thread of something he did not want to name. Sir, the officer said slowly, the planet is reading cold, no power output, no atmospheric processors running, no population signals, life signs, none. Jorah stood up and walked to the scan console himself. He looked at the data. The colony world of Harrow's Edge, home to 300,000 people, according to the last council census, was empty, not bombed, not destroyed, just empty, the way a house is empty when the family has packed its things and left. Structures were still standing, the roads were still there, the landing pads were intact. There was no one home. In the center of the colony where the main settlement sat, one signal was transmitting, a single beacon, broadcasting on all frequencies in clean Vor dialect, so there would be no confusion about who the message was for. Jorah listened to it once. You aimed at the wrong target, ISV relentless. He did not understand what that meant. Not yet. But something in the back of his mind, the part that had survived 60 years of warfare through instinct as much as training, told him to order the fleet to raise shields. He gave that order. He gave it 3 seconds. Too late. The attack did not come from one direction. That was the first thing the post-battle analysts would note later when they tried to piece together what had happened. Every battle doctrine the council used, and that the Voreth specifically were trained in, assumed that an attacking force would come from a position, a direction, a point in space from which the enemy could be identified, targeted, and engaged. Lyra did not come from a position. She came from several. The Relentless and the 14 ships she had gathered in the hours before this moment were small, fast, and had spent the last 18 hours sitting very, very still inside the asteroid belt on the far edge of the Harrow's Edge system, running on minimum power, cold and dark, waiting Several of them had hidden in the long shadow of the colony's moon, tucked in close to the surface where the rock disrupted. Scan signals, two had gone even further. They had powered down entirely and drifted, running on emergency life support, silent as dead metal. They were not trying to destroy the Vanguard fleet. 300 ships against 15. That math did not work. They were not fighting the ships at all. Lyra's targets were the fleet communication relays, the 4 automated buoys the Vanguard had deployed on arrival to maintain contact with Council space. She hit them in the first 30 seconds, all 4 with precision strikes that took out every relay before a single distress signal could be sent. Then she hit the fleet's resupply vessel, a large slow ship sitting at the back of the formation. She did not destroy it, she disabled it. A series of focus shots to its engine array and fuel lines that left the ship floating and intact, but completely unable to move or provide fuel to the warships that needed it. Then she hit the flagship sensor array. The Vor Eternal was suddenly flying blind. Jorth was shouting orders. His bridge crew was working fast, trying to identify targets that kept moving, that split apart and came from different angles, that fired and then went dark before the return shot could track them. The Vanguard was 300 ships trying to fight an enemy that would not hold still and would not stand in one place, and it was like trying to grab smoke. Battle lasted 40 minutes. In those 40 minutes, the Vanguard lost 11 ships, not to destruction, but to disabling hits that took out engines or weapons or power systems. 22 more took damage. The Relentless and her group lost 1 ship, a small frigate whose pilot had pushed too close too fast, and 3 others took light damage. Then the message came, not on any official frequency, on a personal channel encrypted to Fleet Master Joreth's private command code, which meant the sender had somehow gotten access to that code, which was itself a message of its own kind. Fleet Master Joreth, you have lost your communications, your fuel supply, and your ability to see clearly. You can continue this engagement, and we will take more ships apart piece by piece until you have nothing left, or you can leave, go back to Council space and tell them what happened here. I would prefer you choose the second option. There has been enough damage for 1 day. Voss Jorth read it twice. He was not a man who gave up easily. He had fought worse odds than this and won, but he had never fought an enemy who had read the battle so completely before it started, who had removed his ability to call for help, to resupply, and to see before the first shot was even fired. He had never fought someone who offered him the chance to leave, not out of mercy, but because destroying him was not the point. He ordered the retreat. 300 ships folded back into FTL and disappeared from Harrow's Edge, leaving behind the silence they had arrived in, and 1 disabled resupply vessel and 4 dead communication buoys. The colony world sat empty and intact under the light of its sun when the Vanguard fleet emergency signal reached Council space through a backup relay they had not known about. The Council chamber convened within the hour. Joreth's report was short and honest because he was a soldier, and soldiers who lie in their reports get other soldiers killed. He said what happened, all of it. He did not make it sound better than it was. The chamber was very quiet when he finished. Ambassador Dra spoke first. 300 ships, he said very carefully, as if He was not sure the words were right. 300 ships, Jorah confirmed, against 15. Against 15, Ambassador, yes, another. Long silence, the Dravathi. Representative's shell clicked rapidly. Sound that in their language meant something between this should not be possible, and I am reassessing several things I believe to be true. The Fenari pair looked at each other and said nothing. The Theek representatives. Stone gray face did not change, but his massive hands pressed flat on his armrest in a way that suggested he was holding himself still deliberately. Dross said after a while, they knew we were coming. They knew we were coming. Jorah agreed. They evacuated the colony. Before we arrived, every civilian, 300,000 people, moved without any council. Intelligence service detecting it, they left a message for us in our own dialect, telling us we had aimed at the wrong target, which means they chose that target. Ketra said from his seat quietly. Everyone looked at him. They chose to let us come to Harrow's Edge, he said. They chose that system. They evacuated. It set the ambush. Let us walk into it. Heard us enough to send a message in. Then let us leave. They did not try to destroy the fleet. He paused. They were not trying to win that engagement. They were trying to teach us something. The chamber was quiet again. Dross said with the stiffness of a man who has decided that the right answer is to apply more force to a problem than we teach them. Something in return, we call the full Accord Armada. The vote was 5 in favor. Ketra abstained. He did not argue, did not object, did not make a speech. He simply did not raise his hand. After the session ended, he went back to his office and sat alone for a long time. Then he opened a private channel and began composing a message. Not to the council, not to any military command. He addressed it to Commander Lyra Voss, ISV Relentless. He did not know if she would answer. He did not know if reaching out to her was the right move or a futile one. But he was old and he had seen enough wars to know that the best time to talk was before things became impossible to stop, and he was beginning to feel in the deep cold place in his chest that had not warmed since the day of the declaration that impossible was getting close. He wrote one sentence, then he waited back on Harrow's Edge. Lyra stood in the empty main settlement and looked at the quiet streets. The lights were off, the doors were closed, children's toys sat in yards exactly where they had been left the day the evacuation order came through. A mug still sat on a porch railing, left behind in the hurry to go. Someone's home, someone's ordinary life. Interrupted, she looked at it for a long time, then she walked back to her shuttle and she got to work. 4,000 ships was a number that was supposed to end arguments. The Galactic Accord Armada had not been fully assembled in over 100 red years. It was not kept in one place. No station could hold it. No single system could supply it, so it existed mostly as a list of commitments, a promise each member species made when they signed the accord, that if the full Armada was ever called, they would send what they had pledged. Some of them sent a little less than pledged, as they always did, and some sent exactly what they promised. And when it was all added together and arranged in the wide empty space at the edge of human frontier, it was the largest fleet the current generation of any species had ever seen. In one place, 16 species, 4,000 ships, weapons that ranged from old but reliable to experimental and untested. It stretched across the void like a city made of metal and engines, and when it's combined, sensor arrays pointed at human space, it could see very far indeed. The Council was, for the first time since the Declaration, comfortable again. Fleet General Ashari of the Sulking took command of the Armada. She was a careful, thorough officer who had planned this kind of operation before. Large-scale multi-SES coordination, the kind of campaign where the main challenge was not defeating the enemy, but keeping 4,000 ships from getting in each other's way. She drew up a plan. It was a good plan, solid and well organized, built on the assumption that humanity would be forced to defend its territory and that the Armada would simply be too large to stop. She transmitted the plan to the Council. They approved it with minimal changes. Ketra read the plan and then set it down, and did not say anything because he had already said everything he had to say. And no one had listened, and there was a point at which saying the same true thing over and over again stopped being wisdom and started being noise. He had, however, received an answer to his message. It was short, 3 words and a question. "What do you want?" he had written back, and they had begun to talk. The Armada moved into human frontier space on the 43rd day after the Declaration. What it found at the first target system, a mid-sized colony called Vaughn's Post, was a fortified shell. The people were gone. They had been gone for days, moved out through routes that left no trace the Armada scouts could follow. What remained were the structures, and inside those structures, layer after layer of automated defense systems, mines, booby traps, and carefully placed explosives that turned every building into a potential weapon. The colony had been converted from a home into a maze, and the maze was designed not to hold the Armada off forever, but to cost it time, fuel, ammunition, and ships in exchange for ground that no longer mattered because the people it was meant to protect were already somewhere else. Ashari noted this and adjusted her plan. She would bypass fortified colonies and strike at the open supply lines instead. The supply lines were gone, or rather, they had changed. Human resupply ran through dozens of small unmarked routes that shifted position regularly, carried by vessels with minimal power signatures that were nearly impossible to track at long range. The Armada's scouts found a few of them. Most of them vanished before they could be intercepted. She adjusted again. She would strike at the human shipyards, the places where their vessels were being built and repaired. The shipyards had been relocated, not all of them and not quickly, but enough that every time the Armada found what looked like a major target, it turned out to be a secondary facility or an empty shell. The primary construction had moved to smaller, dispersed locations hidden inside asteroid fields and deep system shadows. And while the Armada was searching and adjusting and searching again, the attacks on its edges never stopped. They were not large attacks. They never came from a big force. They came from small groups of fast ships that appeared, hit something specific, a fuel depot, a communication relay, a repair vessel, a sensor platform, and then disappeared before the Armada's response could reach them. No single attack was devastating, but they were relentless and they were precise, and over weeks they added up in a way that the Armada's logistics officers tracked in reports that got longer and more worried every time. Ashari was a careful officer, and she did not panic. But on the 61st day, she sent a report to the council that was the most honest thing she had ever written in her career. She said that the Armada was making slow progress. She said that it was not fighting the war it had been built to fight. She said that the human strategy appeared to be designed to make every advance expensive and every victory empty, and that she did not currently see a clear path to the kind of decisive engagement that would end this conflict quickly. She did not recommend retreat. She recommended patience and resources, more supply, ships, more scouts, more time. The council gave her what it could, which was less than she asked for, because 3 of the member species were already experiencing economic disruptions from having their military assets committed to the Armada for 2 months, and the economies of space-faring civilizations, it turned out, did not enjoy being put on hold indefinitely. Ketra and Lyra had been talking for 3 weeks by the time he asked her the question. They talked in short messages, never long, always encrypted through relay chain that Ketra had set up himself using methods he had learned in his first decade as a military intelligence officer, and had hoped never to need for something like this. He was technically in violation of at least 2 council communication protocols by doing it. He had decided he did not care. He had told her things, honest things about the council, about the Armada, about the state of the war as he saw it, not because he was betraying his people. He did not think of it that way, but because he was old enough to understand that wars which cannot end quickly tend to end badly for everyone, and the only way to end this one was for someone on each side to be honest. She had told him things too, not military details. He had not asked for those, and she would not have given them, but things about humanity, about why they were fighting this way instead of massing for a direct engagement, about what they wanted, or more accurately, what they did not want. They did not want territory. They did not want council resources or council technology or any piece of what the council had. They were not fighting to conquer. They were not fighting out of anger, even though they had plenty of reason for it. They were fighting because someone had pointed a fleet at the people they loved, and the only response that made sense was to make that too expensive to continue. On the 65th day, Ketra wrote her the question he had been building toward for 3 weeks. What would it take, he asked, for your people to stop? The answer came back in 4 words: we want to be left alone. He read it several times. It was simple. It was almost too simple. He thought about the 11 trade violations, the bioscan refusals, the colonies in protected space. He thought about the 6 recorded incidents of telling council representatives to leave. He thought about all of it laid out in Drain's long list, and he thought about those 4 words, and slowly a picture assembled itself in his mind. Humanity had not been building toward this war. Humanity had been trying in ways that were admittedly blunt and often rude to stay out of the council's business. Every violation on that list was an act of refusal, not aggression. Every incident was a door being closed, not a fist being raised. The council had taken those closed doors as disrespect, as primitive behavior, as a problem to be corrected. Humanity had taken the council's correction as a threat to the people they loved, and when someone threatened the people they loved, 4,000 years of hard survival instinct did not ask about diplomatic protocol. Ketra sat with this for a long time. Then he wrote back, "I think that can be arranged, but I will need time and I will need the war to not get worse while I work on it." Her answer came back in under an hour. "Then let's talk about what that looks like." It was on the 78th day that the human engineers project became ready. Lyra had not called it a weapon. Myra had pointed out that technically it was not a weapon, which was true. It was a blockade system, series of automated mines, relay stations, and communication disruptors that once deployed in the right configuration could effectively seal the Kessel Corridor, the single most important transit route between the Armada's current position and the interior of Council space. If the corridor was sealed, the Armada could not be resupplied. It could not retreat cleanly. It could not receive reinforcements. It would be bottled intact, alive, not destroyed, but completely unable to move forward or backward without fighting through the blockade at enormous cost. It took 47 human ships to deploy it. It was done over the course of 6 hours in 3 shifts without a single Council sensor platform detecting it, because the human engineers had spent 2 weeks making sure every piece of the system ran cold until the moment it was activated. Lyra activated it on the 79th day. She did not announce it. She did not send a message to the Council or to Ashari or to anyone. She simply turned it on and waited for the Armada scouts to find it. They found it in about 4 hours. Ashari's report to the Council that evening was shorter than her previous ones. It had only 2 sentences that mattered. "We are blocked. I am requesting new orders in the Council chamber." Someone suggested calling Lyra's move a bluff. Ketra said quietly that in his experience, humanity did not bluff. They set traps. There was a difference. He did not say this to be difficult. He said it because it was true and because time was running out. And he had a plan, but only if the Council would listen. For the first time in this entire war, the chamber went quiet in a way that meant they might actually be ready to hear something. Chamber had not been this quiet since the day of the declaration. That first quiet had been the quiet of confidence. 6 ambassadors pleased with a decision they thought was already resolved, settling back into their chairs with the comfortable belief that the hard part was behind them. This quiet was different. This was the quiet of people looking at a map and realizing with slow and unwilling certainty that every route they thought they had was no longer where they remembered it. 4 months. The war had been running for 4 months. Ketra stood at the center of the chamber where Dra usually stood, and he spoke slowly because he wanted every word to land clearly and stay there. He told them about the Armada first. Ashari's fleet was intact, no mass casualties, no catastrophic losses, but it was stopped. The Kessel Corridor blockade was real. It was deep. And his own tactical people had spent 3 days trying to find a clean way through it and come back with nothing. Going through it by force was possible, but the cost projection was ugly enough that 2 of the Armada species commanders had already submitted formal requests to withdraw their fleets if a resolution was not reached within 30 days. He told them about the economics next. 3 member species were in formal economic distress. The Fenori home world had slowed its trade output by 40% because its merchant fleet had been on military standby for 4 months. The Dravasi were quieter about it, but their trade ministry had been sending signals that Ketra's office had intercepted, not out of any espionage but because the Dravathi signals had been getting louder and less careful, which was a sure sign that someone was worried and not bothering to hide it anymore. He told them finally about the whisper that had been moving through 3 of the outer member species for 6 weeks. The word secession, nobody had said it out loud in official sessions, but it was there in private conversations, in closed channel messages, in the careful silences of ambassadors who were looking at their home world's ledgers and starting to ask whether the Accords' war was their war. The chamber stayed quiet. Drain, to his credit, did not interrupt. He listened to all of it with his 6-fingered hands folded on his knee, and his expression controlled and still. Then he said, "And you have a solution?" "I have a conversation," Ketra said. "I have been having it for 3 weeks. I believe an agreement is reachable with her, with Commander Voss." Yes, there was a pause. "She does not represent the human government," the Thuric representative said. His voice was deep and slow, like rocks grinding together. "She is a single military officer. She is the person who evacuated 300,000 civilians from Harrow's Edge before we arrived." Ketra said. "She is the person who disabled the Vanguard fleet with 15 ships. She is the person who built and deployed the blockade, currently holding 4,000 of our ships in place." He paused. "I am less concerned with her title and more concerned with the fact that she is the most effective human military actor in this conflict, and she has been talking to me, and she has told me what it would take to stop." Another pause, which is Drain asked to be left alone. Ketra said. The chamber sat with that. Lyra received the Council's request for a formal transmission window on the 80th day. She read it twice, told Myra she would need 30 minutes, and then sat alone on the bridge with the lights low and her coffee hot, actually hot this time because she had made it fresh, and she thought carefully about what she was about to do. She was not a diplomat. She had never claimed to be, and she was honest enough with herself to know that this part, the talking part, the ending, it part was harder for her than they fighting had been. Fighting had rules. She understood. You could read battlefield, see the shape of it, make a decision and act on it. Talking was different. Talking was trying to reshape something that had already been built badly and get it to hold weight anyway. But she was also tired, not broken. Tired, not the kind of tired that means you are done, the kind of tired that meant she had been doing this long enough that finishing it correctly had become more important than anything else. She thought about the mug on the porch railing at Harrow's Edge. Someone's ordinary morning interrupted. She thought about the pilot they had lost in the Vanguard engagement, a 23-year-old from a colony in the outer belt who had wanted to be a ship designer before the declaration came through and changed his plans. She thought about the 300,000 people who were living in temporary housing on 4 different colony worlds, waiting to go home. She thought about what finally had meant the night she said it. It had not meant that she was happy about this. It had not meant she had wanted a war. It had meant that the long, uncomfortable in between was over. The years of closed doors and refusals and telling council representatives to leave, the slow, escalating pressure of a governing body that had decided humanity needed to be managed. All of that had been building towards something, and now the something had arrived, and at least a thing that had arrived could be dealt with, a thing that was still approaching could only be worried about. She was done worrying. She was ready to deal with it. She finished her coffee, straightened in her chair, and opened the channel. The transmission came through live to the council chamber. Lyra's face appeared on the main display, small screen, plain background, the kind of image that a ship's internal camera produces. Nothing staged about it. She looked exactly like what she was, someone sitting at their workstation who had things to do and was choosing to spend a portion of her time on this. She did not greet them warmly. She did not greet them coldly either. She simply said, "I understand you want to talk. I will say what I have to say, and then you can ask questions." Drain nodded once. She spoke for about 8 minutes. She said it plainly in the kind of simple and direct language that left very little room to be misunderstood. Humanity would remain sovereign, its government, its laws, its decisions about its own people in its own space, not subject to council authority, not now, not under new terms, not under modified terms. The sovereignty was the foundation, and it was not movable. The colonies humanity had established in protected space were humanity's colonies. The systems they were in were dead worlds with no native life, and the protection placed on them had been done without human input or agreement, so that protection did not apply. The bioscan mandates were refused as they had always been refused. Humanity's population data was its own. The trade agreements would be renegotiated, not canceled, renegotiated by representatives sitting across a table as equals, not as a governing body in a managed species. Equal parties, equal voices. If the council could agree to that, there was a framework for trade that could work for everyone. There would be no apology from humanity for any of the listed violations, because humanity did not believe it had done anything that required an apology. And going forward, the Galactic Accord Council would operate on the clear understanding that humanity was not a member civilization, it was a neighbor. Neighbors could have agreements. Neighbors could have trade. Neighbors could have communication channels and maybe in time a decent working relationship, but a neighbor was not subject to the rules of the household next door and anyone who came to humanity's door with a fleet instead of a conversation should expect humanity to answer accordingly. She paused after that last part just for a moment. "I want to be very clear," she said. "We did not start this. We pushed back hard when it started, and I think the last 4 months have demonstrated that we can push back harder if that becomes necessary. We are not interested in destroying the accord. We are not interested in any of your territory or any of your resources. What happened here was expensive and painful for people on both sides, and none of it had to happen. I would prefer it does not happen again. I think you would prefer that too." She looked directly at the camera. "I think we understand each other," she said. "Now it is your turn." The council deliberated for 2 days. It would have taken longer, but the Fenari sent a private message on the 2nd day, indicating that if a resolution was not reached by the end of the week, they would be withdrawing their fleet commitment, and that message moved the timeline noticeably. The vote, when it came, was 5 in favor of accepting Lyra's terms. 1 member, the sulking second chair representative, not Drain himself, who had retreated into a stiff silence that might have been dignity or might have been the look of a man reevaluating his career. choices voted against, and was quietly removed from his position by the sulking government within the week, because even the sulking had looked at the last 4 months and decided they were ready for this to be over. Ketra was last to vote. He sat for a moment with his hand above the confirmation panel. He thought about the words he had said in this chamber 4 months ago. You have never seen them truly angry, and about the 6 votes that had not listened. He thought about 30,000 years of Vorath history and the war that had taught his people that going to space together was better than dying apart. He thought about a species that had survived 6 extinctions and carried all of it with them into the stars, every single scar. He pressed his hand to the panel. The confirmation registered. The agreement was sealed. The blockade powered down in sections over the following 12 hours, and the Armada withdrew in good order, and the announcement went out across all frequencies in all languages, and in temporary housing on 4 colony worlds. 300,000 people started making plans to go home on the bridge of the ISV. Relentless, Myra processed the final confirmation and let a few seconds pass. Before she spoke, she did not do it to be dramatic. She did it because the moment seemed like it deserved a few seconds. It's over, Commander, she said. Lyra was already at the viewport. She had her coffee, a fresh one, hot, held in both hands, and she was looking at the stars the way she always looked at them when she was thinking, steady and quiet and very still. She thought about the word finally and what it had cost and what it had meant. She thought about the mug on the porch railing and the young pilot from the outer belt and 300,000 people going home. She thought about humanity not as an idea, not as a symbol, but as a collection of specific people in specific places who had trusted her and shown up and done what needed doing, and snorts were now going to get to go back to the ordinary lives that the declaration had interrupted. She took a slow sip of her coffee. No, she said simply, and her voice was quiet and level and completely certain. It's starting. Myra processed that for a moment. The negotiations for the trade framework begin in 3 weeks, she offered. I know Admiral Ketra has requested a face-to-face meeting. He says he would like to talk without encryption for once. I know there are also 14 new volunteer requests from ships that want a crew under your command going forward, and 2 colony governors who want to speak with you about permanent frontier defense arrangements. Lyra was quiet for a moment, then something that was not quite a smile but was close to one moved across her face. Tell them I will get back to them, she said. She turned from the viewport and walked to her console, and she sat down. And she got to work outside the ship. The stars were the same as they had always been, cold and far away and indifferent to the wars of small creatures in the dark between them. They had been there before humanity climbed out of its cradle world. They would be there long after, but humanity was out there now too, moving through the dark, with all its scars and its stubbornness, and its deep and total refusal to stop. Not because it was the strongest species, or the fastest or the most powerful, because it was the one that, when everything came at it, looked up at the stars and said finally, and meant it. End of story.